Hi, I'm Dale Sherbeck, and welcome to the HQ, a CHA Learning and Healthcare Can podcast serial where we dive into healthcare issues and topics from the perspective of its people and discuss them with those that are leading in the health system. Together, we'll try to unpack these topics and learn what actions are being taken to innovatively solve them today. So, March is National Nutrition Month, and today's topic is one which is very close and dear to my own heart and family. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm more passionate about food than almost anything else. I remember a debate I once had in my early 20s with an in law who was adamant that we eat to live, in contrast to my own position that I live to eat. For me, food is about more than survival. Yes, it is critically about nourishment and nutrition, but for me, it is also about identity. It's about community, family, and all my relationships, including my relationship to the land itself. And it is about pleasure. And with that, I think you have both a glimpse into me, your host, as well as today's guest, whom I'm pretty sure feels the same. So I won't steal her thunder by going on too much more about this. However, you might be asking, hey, this is a podcast about people and healthcare. Why are we talking about nutrition? All of which I can appreciate because few connect a passionate discussion about food with any discussion about healthcare. After all, when you think about food you don't want to eat, many people are going to cite the stereotypical food associated with hospitals. And without intending any spoilers for the conversation we're going to have today, you're going to hear that not only doesn't it have to be that way, it shouldn't be this way. And increasingly, in more and more healthcare facilities, it isn't that way because more and more believe, like me, that food, at its core, is not only critically important to our physical health, but it is also critical to our psychosocial health. So today, I'm joined by Professor Heather Keller, who, among other accomplishments, has led the research and development of the Choice Plus program, which includes an e-learning course and a community of practice developed in partnership with the Research Institute for Aging, or RIA as it is called. Choice Plus, as you'll hear in this episode, is an acronym for a set of 6 guiding principles that aims to improve the mealtime experience for residents in long-term care. By bringing leaders, team members, residents, and family to the table, the program focuses on the relationship-centered practices enhancing the dining environment. Professor Heather Keller is the Schlegel Research Chair in Nutrition and Aging at the University of Waterloo. She is an internationally recognized expert in geriatric nutrition, assessment, and treatment. Her research areas focus on nutrition, risk, and malnutrition identification and treatment across care sectors, improving nutrition care processes and implementing screening and other best practices, supporting food intake of diverse groups living in the community, including those living with dementia, and improving hospital and residential food and promoting food intake and the mealtime experience in these settings. Professor Keller has led several national research and knowledge translation projects, including the landmark Nutrition Care in Canadian Hospitals, More to Eat, and Making the Most of Mealtimes in Long-Term Care Studies. Professor Keller has published more than 250 peer-reviewed articles and translate much of this evidence into practice with tools and resources. As a founding member and a past chair and co-chair of the Canadian Malnutrition Task Force, she is involved in translating research into practice and advocating for improvements in nutrition care. She is currently the co-chair of the Primary Care Working Group for the CMTF and involved in several national and international expert groups advancing the prevention, detection, and treatment of malnutrition. Hi, Heather, and welcome to the HQ.
Thanks, Dale. It's great to be here.
So, Heather, since March is National Nutrition Month, perhaps we could start the conversation with you sharing with me your relationship with food and nutrition and why it's so important to you and what has been your journey.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and food has always been a big part of my life. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but she was actually an ex-teacher, and
Mm-hmm.
so food was a big part of our life because it was her passion to be cooking and creating. And for example, she led our 4-H group, so food was always a big part of our lives, and we always had shared meals together at home as well. I can remember we would wait for my dad to get home. He was often out of the area because he was a truck driver, and
Mm-hmm.
getting him home on time for supper, we would wait because it was so important that we share our meals together. Um, then moving into my spouse, his family was a huge family, and they would get together frequently to eat together. And I realized how incredibly important meals were for connecting that family. We'd get together a few times a year and have these big meals and share and talk, and it was wonderful. I started actually in my food journey though, working in restaurants and seeing that side of the food business, if you will,
Hmm.
and always had a passion for foods. It wasn't surprising when I decided to end up doing a nutrition degree, because I thought that was just a natural thing to do. I didn't really know what a dietitian was, but I knew food was at the part of that role. And so I worked for many years as a dietitian, and then went back to school and did my PhD, etc. But I think what brought me to seeing mealtimes the way I do now was I had the opportunity to do a study with persons living with dementia in the community, and my daughter had just been born at the same time. And here I was at home analyzing these qualitative interviews, people talking about the importance of eating with each other when they had dementia in the family. And here I was having a small child, that feeding relationship that you develop with a small child when they're learning to eat and feed themselves. And
Hmm.
it clicked for me. I thought, this is so much more than just the food that's on the plate that I'd been, as a nutrition or a dietitian, very much the focus of. It's really about this whole relationship around the food that brought me back to those principles I learned at home, 4-H and all those sorts of things, brought it back, that this is really what's something we need to highlight more than we are. Um, and so that led to the Eating Together study. Shortly thereafter, I came back from my maternity leave and talked to a few colleagues who are experts in dementia and said, I think I have something here, but I don't know how to start investigating it. And we launched the Eating Together study. And it was a 6-year longitudinal study talking to people living with dementia in the community and their care partners as they journeyed through living with dementia, and even moving into long-term care retirement homes. And we didn't talk about the food, what they were eating, but how they were eating,
Hmm.
what food meant to them as their roles, their way of connecting with each other or staying connected, as a way of adapting and evolving to what was happening in their lives. And we saw, in a way, meals were a microcosm of life, quite frankly. That may sound rather silly, I suppose, but if you think about sociologists, they study families at meals because it tells us something about the family, right?
Hmm.
And so there's this thing about meals that are much beyond the nutrition, I think, and how can we then use meals therapeutically, not just as a place to study, but how can we see meals as a way to actually build connection, build relationship? And when someone has dementia, and they're starting to have challenges around the environment, around themselves, and being able to communicate with that environment, how can we use the meal to be able to make them feel like they belong, that they are valued, that this is an important part of their life, right? So that's sort of where I've gone with the research, and that's a little bit of how that journey has happened for me.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, it's certainly resonates with me, and I think it's a beautiful journey, and I think, as you described, I mean, it's a huge part of our social fabric, our probably our species as a whole. I mean, I think in terms of even anthropology, right? In terms of us being hunter gatherers, it was a community that sort of foraged and kept each other alive. So, I mean, food is critical to who we are. So yeah, I'm looking forward to where this takes us. So you've talked obviously a little bit in terms of your work and how it's taking you into sort of the geriatric nutrition and long-term care. So I suspect many people, if they visited a long-term care facility, may have a fairly reasonable understanding of what meal times might look in a facility or traditional facility as we might define them. Um, but maybe to make sure that we all have the same starting point, maybe can you, using, I guess, intentionally a bit of a pun here, set the table for us for what does a typical mealtime look like in a long-term care facility? And then sort of teasing out, where we're going to go with this. I mean, where do you see the issue with that and what's missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, just over a decade ago, I took up the Schlegel Research Chair in Nutrition and Aging, and I'm cross-appointed at the University of Waterloo and the Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging. So it gave me this opportunity to really look at long-term care in much more detail than I had before. I'd worked in rehab and community and all those other places. So this really was an amazing opportunity. And we realized through doing some early observations in dining room that something important was going on, and we needed to create measurement tools to understand what was going on in the dining room. So we spent some time doing that, and we created a tool that looks at the eating environment, so the dining environment as a whole, but then also as a meal is going on, what's happening in the meal. And the aspects we look at are not only the physical features, which are very important, of course, but
Mm-hmm.
also the social interactions that happen in that space that might be limited because of space or might be limited for other reasons. And also what we call relationship-centered care, person-centered care, resident-centered care, similar sort of concepts with this idea that there's more than just the food. It's the interaction between people and how they're treated, dignified care, that sort of thing that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So what we saw when we were doing this very large study called Making the Most of Mealtimes in 4 provinces across Canada was it varied, hugely varied. But we had, small dining rooms that were more intimate, to very, very large dining rooms. And so the key features, I think, that when people think of a traditional long-term care home, they might see it as the walls kind of bare, perhaps, maybe more institutional-like furniture, maybe even mismatched furniture because it's been a long-standing home, for example. Maybe not too functional in terms of its dining space. It might be a place where people eat, and then maybe food is brought in on a bulk trolley for serving, or perhaps there's a stationary steam table where food is served out of. That's what people might think of traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't necessarily conducive to what we want to see happen in dining room. Certainly we saw better homes as well and better dining rooms. And we're seeing that now. People are picking up this message that it really is about home. And many homes are moving towards this idea. Let's make sure there's culturally appropriate, excuse me, excuse me there, culturally appropriate pictures on the wall. Excuse me. So I think thinking about what we'd like to see would be those culturally appropriate pictures on the wall, thinking about dining furniture that is accessible and usable by the older adult that's there, having an open servery where they can smell the food, maybe even be involved in preparing the food. So there is this range out there, but certainly the traditional old style of home tends to be very institutional feeling. And when we had our folks that were in the Eating Together study, some of them moving into care, we didn't talk so much about the physical features with them, but what was it like to be moving from home and moving now into a care situation where we're eating with other people? And they talked about it really being a system. And they felt like a little bit like a cog in the wheel. It wasn't very individualized anymore. They just couldn't go up to the refrigerator at any time and pick out what they wanted. It was
Mm-hmm.
timed. They had a seat that they had to sit in. They had to sit with certain people. They had food that they might have 2 choices, but if they were in their own home, they might have had other choices, right? And so it
Yeah.
felt very much like a system. They talked about it being rushed. They didn't feel like they could talk with family in that space. Maybe even family weren't allowed in this space during meal times because it was too congested. Back when I first started my career, I would even go into homes and the doors would be locked with a chain with a padlock around the door, and it was only to be used for meals and nothing else, right? So we need to get away from that. We need to see that meals are a part of life. It's part of the home. It's part of the way we live, and we can't just see it as a task to be done. I think that's where we need to move away from.
Yeah, it makes, I think, perfectly good sense. And I think probably for most of us, if we were observing our own, our own homes, right? I mean, when we set that mealtime experience, I mean, it's about, more than just even the food itself. It's creating an ambiance. It's creating right, a whole experience, maybe music, maybe, other smells that are going on in that space that, draws us all to that table. And yes, I guess it sort of begs the question, why do we stop doing that?
Yeah.
Because people are in a care facility.
Yeah, it's interesting. The dining room, as I say, is often in a neighborhood, so it's located close to bedrooms, but where people congregate is often a common area far away from that. It doesn't make any sense to me that we don't use that dining space for life of the village or life of the neighborhood, right? It is in our homes, and it's an odd thing, and I don't know why that is. And maybe it comes down to people being busy, staff wanting it to stay clean, food safety rules, things like that as well, that make it challenging to be more flexible and be more open with the space. That's probably part of it, I imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, because I think in other conversations or conferences I've attended, talking about more people sort of centered care sort of approaches, and some of the challenges, the way our institutions have been set up, right? They are there conveniently designed for the people who work there, not for the people who receive care
Yeah.
there. And I think probably some of what you're describing there probably is a further example of that.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, we're going from living in your own home where you're maybe feeding a small number of people, 4 or 5, to now feeding 100 people at the same time, right? And in a 1 hour period of time. And so that processes that have to happen to make that happen are very systematized, right? And
Hmm.
very rigorous. And that flexibility, that individualization is challenging, which is what's required for person-centered care. Right?
Yeah,
Where I want to sit in the dining room, when I want to come to the dining room to eat. Maybe I want to have breakfast in my room in bed. I can't do that now because people want me to go to the dining room at a certain time. And when people lose their capacity for self-mobilization, they're very dependent then on the team members to get them where they're going. So it's often, again, to the schedule that is available, unfortunately, with the team members, right? Because they're so short-staffed in
yeah.
long-term care homes. Yeah.
So building on some of those challenges, I can imagine that the picture changes substantially when you start to introduce dementia, as you've raised a few times now. So perhaps you could further illustrate this for us. I mean, how does living with dementia impact meal times and nutrition?
Yeah, I mean, people living with dementia experience the world differently, right? They may not understand what's being said to them. What they say in turn, they're not being understood by others. They can get frustrated, as you can imagine, then as well. The
Hmm.
environment is perhaps overwhelming to them. Perhaps they have changes in their visual perception of the spaces. Many people with dementia have changes in their sensory capacity, right? And so all of these things, the environment doesn't seem the same to the person. It's challenging to the person. So now you can imagine going into a dining room that might have many people in it. Maybe you're brought in as a person with dementia and told to sit at this table. You don't know why you're sitting at this table, where the table over there looks, someone over there, you like to sit with them instead. You're told to
Hmm.
sit at this table because that's your table. And then you sit down and then you're waiting and there isn't any food and it doesn't seem to be happening. And then go, well, I guess I've already eaten, I'm going to leave and get up and go, right? And so the environment isn't necessarily adapting to the needs of these individuals who have these challenges with communicating in their environment, right? And so this is it's further suppresses the capacity of people, I think, when we have these large environments, right? And when it's more individualized. Say, I've seen this happen in some homes where they actually take the folks that might have significant challenges with dementia into the dining area, and they're at a table, and they actually get them their food first, right? Because they know that if they don't, they might get up and wander away, or
Hmm.
start to have some other challenges and expressions in that environment. And so we need to figure out how to adapt our environment to support individuals better. I think that's the key thing. We also see as people progress with dementia having significant eating challenges.
Hmm.
In our Making the Most of Mealtime study, we found that those people who were getting total eating assistance from a team member, they ate enough food because there was that one-on-one assistance, right?
Makes
But
sense.
people that were starting to lose their ability, maybe they would stop during the meal, maybe they lose attention, um, they would actually not eat as well. And so we need to recognize when those eating challenges happen and how to support them. And so there's some things that we can do that support folks, but it's that attention, and again, that time for team members to do the encouragement, to come back and sit down at the table with folks and talk with them, and perhaps encourage them to self-feed. That's really important. We tend not to have that time right now in long-term care to do that, right? It's relatively few staff in a dining room, and if people need eating assistance, that assistance is given and in a sense of efficiency to try to get the person fed, rather than taking the time to encourage them and continue to self-feeding. But we know that many people can continue to hold a glass, for example, or wipe their own mouth with their napkin, but we lose because we're often providing that assistance, we just take over, right?
Yeah.
In being efficient. And that's not the thing to do. We should try to give them the opportunity as much as possible to participate in the meal. As I say, wiping their mouth, talking about what they want on the plate. So, for example, if you're assisting someone to eat, say I've got, potatoes, I've got some chicken here and some peas. What would you like to start with first? Giving the person the opportunity to decide what they want to start with, even if they don't communicate verbally, but they might, with their eyes, look at what they want to have. That gives you an indication of what they want to eat. So dementia, as I say, it leads to the challenges. The environment often isn't supportive. The environment we have, it might be too rushed, too chaotic, too noisy, not thinking about what that individual needs at this moment in time to help them to be successful with their meal.
And then that further impacts, I guess, the quality of life as you or health and right leads to other, I guess, maybe comorbidities or right in terms of nutritional intake and
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And so we've shown again in the Making the Most of Mealtime study that when the dining environment was more relationship centered, people ate more.
Hmm.
So it's not just the quality of life that we're upholding of the person and their resident-centered care, but it also will affect their physical health, we believe, as well.
Hmm. So you've sort of have talked a little bit about this and around empowering, I guess, the residents in the space and giving them choice. I think as you just described in terms of what do you want to eat on that plate first. So I think a nice segue into the program that you've been working on for the last few years now, and the Choice Plus program, which is a great acronym. It certainly is, I think, pretty much talks about what we've been talking about so far. So you framed the the challenges. I think we've got a pretty good picture of what's happening in some of our long-term care facilities. So, yeah, so can you break down the Choice Plus program for us and give us a sense of what that is, and let's take it from there.
Yeah, so it started out again of that eating together study. We realized there's some principles here that are what is a good mealtime, right? Whether it be in someone's own home, or a retirement home, or long-term care, or a hospital. Right. And that's where we came up with these principles. So choice stands for C is for connecting. This idea that it's an opportunity, a shared opportunity, might be, it's a guaranteed opportunity. If you think about in a family where you can sit down and chat and connect and re-engage, right? So that's what
Mm-hmm.
happens. H is for honoring dignity, this idea that we all have individual preferences and choice, and how can we uphold that rather than saying this is the way it's going to be. Try to give people that choice, that autonomy that they want to have. O is for offering support. Again, this idea that's based on the individual needs. I spoke just before about, we can often, in our trying to be efficient, take over the role of all the eating tasks. And that leads a person to being more feeling, I guess, of not able to do anything, right? That they don't have any capacity. And that's not what we want. We want people to feel like they have a role, they have capacity. And so offering support in a way that it's individualized based on their needs now. We know, for example, that in the morning, people might be very different than they are at night. They're tired
Mm-hmm.
at night. They might need help at night. But in the morning, everything's just fine and dandy. So why do we actually have to have the same level of eating assistance or support at meal times the same across those 3 meals? No, it really should be individualized. Even within a meal, people get tired, right?
Mm-hmm.
Towards the end of the meal, and that help is needed a little bit more. I is for identity, this idea that we're all individuals in that space. And this is a challenge, right? We're here with many people in the dining room, whether it be, 10 people or 100 people in the dining room. Um, we're all individuals in that space. We're not just this body of a group of people. So
Mm-hmm.
how can we accept and know each individual so we can provide again for those preferences and honor that dignity that we have? The last C is for creating opportunities. This idea that food is a big part of our lives, as you said at your intro, right? It's a huge part of your life. It's an opportunity to be creative. It's an opportunity to have a meaningful role. Um, every family, well, I shouldn't say that, maybe every family, but many families, when they're in the kitchen together, they take on different roles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone might wash the dishes, someone might wash the vegetables, someone stirs the pot, whatever it may be. But there's different roles around food in a family. It's a very important part of our life, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
all these roles: grocery shopping, making the list, all these individual little roles that we can take on. So it's meaningful. So how can we provide in that setting where food is now provided for people? They're no longer doing the grocery shopping, they're no longer making the list, no longer choosing the menu. How can we bring back those opportunities to be creative, to be involved?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for people with living with dementia, they sometimes want to take on that role. They see, oh, here's a big dining room, and maybe it's a person who always had large gatherings in their home, and they just feel it's important for them to clean the plates. That's what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can't be sitting quietly and waiting for someone else to pick up the plate. They want to do that, so we should let them do that, right? And encourage them to do that and support them to do those roles. Some people want to say grace. Some people want to are the person that's sort of an entertainer. How can we give that opportunity to do that in the meal so they feel like they have a role? So meals, because they're a big activity in anybody's life, is a place for roles and a place that we have opportunity for that. The final letter is E for enjoyment. And so this is what we should be trying to achieve in a mealtime. It's enjoyment beyond the food. The food is obviously a big part of it too, but how can we make the meal enjoyable? And that's going to be different for individuals, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
imagine, let's say, I remember this gentleman. I was actually asked how there was this fellow that didn't want to come to the dining room very much. He wasn't very social, and they realized that because he used to be a truck driver, he would always just sit at the counter and people would be chatting around him, sort of thing. And they realized if they put him at a table looking out the window with people around him, he's much more happy to be in the dining room, wasn't going away and wandering off, because that was what he was used to, right? So can we think about what makes it enjoyable for each individual? What can we flex in this dining space to allow for that opportunity for that individual? Maybe it's sitting down and having tea after the meal and chatting and not being rushed away to the rooms because we want to clean the floor. You can see people what they want to have. They don't, they sit and wait perhaps. And wait for the meal to be finished and want to sit and enjoy, understanding that's what they're wanting. Or if you see some people coming to the meal early, they want that interaction perhaps with the team members and give a time to chat with that person for a little bit, or maybe they want to have a role in the dining room. So figuring out again what people need will help to lead to that enjoyment. So that's a large part of what that is about. And so you can see all these principles are really connected together, Dale. They're not individual.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I think they're values that most of us would hold in our own um, our own everyday lives. Or I was going to say our non-institutionalized lives, right? I mean that we hold as part of our our being, and so I think you certainly through the acronym and the examples that you've provided certainly demonstrate why these have become critically important just because we now are in a place that I don't want to use the word institution, but a facility where you are being cared for and about, right? That these things still need to find ways, I think, of becoming part of the people's lives and their everyday.
Yeah, these homes are people's home.
Yeah.
So how can we make that the highlight of the day, right?
Yeah.
Certainly entertainment in the afternoon or playing bingo or whatever it may be, those also give enjoyment. But some folks can't participate in those activities anymore, but they still eat, right?
Yeah.
And so how can we make the meal enjoyable? Even when someone can't communicate verbally and requires eating assistance, how do we make that mealtime special for them? Maybe it's knowing that they want to be their arm gently touched or making eye contact when you're assisting them to eat, showing that they're valued and they're meaningful, right? That's what I think we're trying to achieve with Choice Plus.
Yeah. It's huge, and and likely bigger for some people than others, right? But nevertheless, there's that, I think, as you described, that in need for individualization and that to sort of help people to sort of connect to things that certainly are important. So where does the plus come into the acronym, Heather?
That's a great question. And so when we started out with the choice principles, we knew we had something important here, but we weren't really sure how to make it happen. And so we did an early study, and we call it development evaluation, where you sort of change things as you go. And we realized what was needed was using behavior change techniques and using change management principles and quality improvement principles to really make it take hold in a home. So that's where the
Mm-hmm.
plus comes from, this idea that's the principles plus the approach to helping home team members take in and absorb and really live the principles.
Makes sense. I I was sort of thinking that might be the connection. I certainly draw on the fact that in an earlier part of my own career, when I worked in an organization that was implementing Six Sigma, and they had made it their own by saying we do Six Sigma Plus, and the plus being that you needed to talk about the facilitation, the change management principles that were necessary to make these things go, because otherwise, the they would assume that the adoption rates would fail in most cases. So maybe I think as I've read in terms of preparing for our discussion today, um, your research, you've demonstrated this in 3 homes, if I remember reading correctly, and maybe that number's different today. Maybe you could describe a little bit what you learned and how it may be further applied from that research.
Yeah, so we did a study where we had 3 homes that were willing to try out the Choice Plus program. And at the point when we did this study, we had an external facilitator going in the home. Her name is Dr. Sarah Wu, who's part
Mm-hmm.
of the Choice Plus program now as well. But basically, we very different homes, different management styles, different types of homes, size, that sort of thing. And the dining rooms similarly were different. And so what I think we learned from that process is that every dining room can improve. Even a wonderful dining room can still make improvements because team members change, residents change. There's always opportunity for improvement, right? And so I think that's the first takeaway, is that everybody can improve and everybody has something they can work on and make it better for the residents and the team members. So that's the first thing we learned. Secondly, it doesn't really matter some of the because we had very different homes, we could show it would work in different types of settings, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think the key thing is a willingness for a home to take on and work on issues. Seeing the value of mealtimes is probably the most important part of it. If they have that sense that mealtimes can be more than they are now for both residents and team members, but also family members that might be in there or volunteers, that's the nugget that needs to start the process, right? The kernel, if you will, that starts the process. Every home can use the Choice Plus principles and the strategies we have in there around behavior change techniques, make them their own, and they can achieve benefits. It may be a different trajectory towards those changes for sure, because they might have to backtrack or do other things. But we found our steps that we created in this the plus part of the Choice Plus program worked, and people saw a change happening. So I think those are the key things we learned. I think we also learned that um, Choice Plus helps team members work together. So even outside of a mealtime, the things they learned
Mm-hmm.
from the Choice Plus program about how to be empowered to make change, how to make a change continue to happen, how as team members to get behind a change and create that change themselves. That could translate beyond meal times, right? It could be about things they could take in other parts of the home and other parts of their work role. So that was a good learning for us as well, that we could see people saying, I've learned some really important techniques here that I can think about and move ahead.
Yeah, I think, and that makes total sense, Heather. I mean, I think we learn this, and I think in our own programs related to quality and patient safety and things like that, that talks about that the investments in these spaces not only obviously lead to better outcomes, but they create better job satisfaction in staff members, and they feel more commitment to their passion and purpose, and that has an exponential, I guess, impact in terms of their performance and their roles.
Yeah. And I think that the power of Choice Plus, it isn't you must do these things in your dining room, right? People get told a lot of what they must do. And Choice Plus says, here's the principles. It's about connecting, honoring dignity, whatever it may be. And people think about, well, what does that mean for our dining room? What are we doing that we could do differently and make people feel like they belong more in the dining room and they can connect better, right? And so it really empowers them to think about their own challenges, which, as you say, it gives them satisfaction then, right?
Yeah.
In a sense that they're making improvements, they're making choices, and they're working with residents and family to decide what needs to be better, and we can do this together.
Hmm. Very cool. Um, so the last 3 years have introduced this thing called the pandemic, which is discombobulated so many states of normal. Um, what role has that played in I mean, we talked about traditional meal times, but I mean, from your observation, what role has it played in meal times, meal service delivery? I mean, I certainly can guess the answer, whether things got better or worse. And has it further impacted, I guess, the Choice Plus program as you've seen it sort of implemented in certain places?
Yeah. Yeah, so we actually had the opportunity to do a survey about 6 months into the pandemic. We had received funding to look at relationship-centered care with a survey in long-term care, and decided to obviously look at that still, but put on the spin of, what changed because of COVID. And in those early stages of the pandemic, people were eating in their rooms, isolated in their rooms to eat. There are very few touch points with staff because staff didn't want to be bringing things into people, right? Um, People would be given a tray with styrofoam dishes on it. The food would not be necessarily warm anymore because you can imagine plating it, and they didn't necessarily have the equipment to transit around a neighborhood and to keep it hot. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with food and meals. And as part of that survey, we actually did interviews with care providers working in long-term care. But we also had the opportunity, I did some interviews with caregivers and residents in early 21, and they talked about this was just not good for their community, not good for the residents for sure, and they saw real negative effects. So those were the challenges. And so because we were trying to keep people safe, we lost some of that, the opportunities of meals, right, of that social interaction. There were some good things that happened too, quite frankly. And so in that one survey that I was saying that we did, we actually asked people what was the thing that they felt was missing the most at mealtimes for the residents. And they said it was the social interaction, actually. So it reinforced for people the importance of family caregivers in this space,
Hmm.
for the social interactions that we have for residents, how incredibly important they are. It wasn't just a task, right? Many homes were able to go back to dining and having people outside of their rooms for eating, but still didn't have recreation activities, still did not have entertainment. So that became for a while the only social opportunity people had outside of their rooms. And so they recognized the incredible importance of mealtime. So that was a benefit, I think. They also, I think, realized too that when we talked to some of the residents and family that eating in different spaces, like in the maybe the recreation room that had plants and bright windows or facing a garden. That was actually nice because their
Mm-hmm.
dining room wasn't as pleasant a place because it didn't have that same view, didn't have more intimate space, right? And so spreading people in these smaller areas or congregating in them in their, in their groups so that they didn't spread anything, that more intimate space was appreciated. So we learned some things that what people want, right, as well out of this. So I think that's how the pandemic sort of rolled out. And I think now people realize the incredible importance again of why meals are beyond food. It's really about this social interaction, relationship-centered care. And then two, the huge importance of caregivers that are family members coming into the home to support meal times, not just eating assistance, but also they bring in community. They bring in opportunities to interact where maybe a resident doesn't have a family member that visits very much, but family caregivers of another resident interact with them, right? And so that's really important. And I think we realized that out of the pandemic. Choice Plus, where it went, because we actually, just before the pandemic started, we tried to do a 1-day training, a leadership training, and we had great success with it, great uptake of people coming, and they said they really enjoyed the training that we had. So after our 3-home study, we realized there's no way we can just do external facilitation. We'd never reach enough homes, right? We have to
Mm-hmm.
build a model where we can train champions in their own homes to make change. And so we built this, manual and model of training. It was a 1-day training, and we were going to do follow-up community practice sort of things. We couldn't do the follow-up, but we realized people can learn the principles without an external facilitator, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's package this in some shape or form. And the Schlegel-UW RIA actually decided to take this project on. And because they were moving a lot of long-term care training, IPAC training, things like that, had to go virtual very quickly with the pandemic, they realized, hey, let's try making Choice Plus an e-learning as well. And so that's what they've done over the last couple of years with a supportive advisory team. And I've obviously a part of that as well as Dr. Sarah Wu. And so we now have this great e-module that we're just starting to roll out, and hopefully people see as valuable. It teaches them not only the principles, but how to do that change management, that quality improvement piece, those behavior change techniques, which are that plus part in the
Mm-hmm.
Choice Plus.
Great. So, I mean, by the sounds of it, I mean, you very positively have not wasted this crisis, and used it as an opportunity to make improvements and reinforce, I think, the value of the work that you're doing. Um, so a big question for you. I mean, some of it you've already covered a little bit, but I mean, as I've alluded to, and we ourselves at CHA Learning are heavily committed to people-centered care, as our listeners can see in our own programming. So I'd like to discuss, the relationship between resident-centered care, nutrition, and meal times. And you've alluded to as well, right? The ethical challenges that the pandemic clearly demonstrated was that choice between safety and quality, and the quality of life very specifically. How does that play out, I guess, in the way that menus and food services are designed in long-term care? And I know this is a huge topic. So, with a lot of different factors and policy implications in terms of what we do and why we don't do certain things. But how would you suggest that we think about this in a different way, and perhaps to, guide us to a new paradigm, if it were, um, and why is it so important that we do think about this differently?
Yeah. Well, food, as I said, could be the highlight of the day for people, the
Mm-hmm.
meals, right? And so it takes that investment to have good food. In Ontario, we happen to have a pretty good raw food budget compared to other provinces in the country with respect to food. But food is expensive, right? And quality food takes quality ingredients. That's a first key thing, is that we need to invest in food. Second, we have to invest in the personnel that are making the food. So we can have wonderful raw ingredients, but if we don't give people time to make that lasagna or make that cake, then we're going to buy pre-purchased or pre-made products, right? Because it's going to be more efficient for us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a key thing. If we want to actually have foods that are people want to eat, that are culturally appropriate, that meet their needs and preferences, then we need to make sure there's the staff in the kitchen to make the food, and they have the skill set needed as well, right? So that's, salaries and all those sorts of things. We have to invest in that. And I think that the last thing is even around making menus. It is an incredibly hard job to make menus for a group of people. In
Mm-hmm.
hospital, it's hard, but they're only there for a short period of time. But you can imagine people living now in a retirement home or long-term care home long term, meeting the preferences and needs of a very large group of people who have different cultures, different ways they like to eat. It's challenging, right? It's extremely challenging. And then coupled with staffing for making that food and the budget that you have to work with that food, it's an extremely challenging job. So we need to invest in the folks that create menus to have the skills to do this. I actually have a doctoral student working on this idea of culturally sensitive menus in long-term care because it's a huge need.
Mm-hmm.
And people may not have the skill set they need to do that. Um, Another skill set is understanding what's in the food. And so being able to do nutrient analysis of the food and make sure it's at the right level of all the nutrients for old adults. Homes don't necessarily have the time to do that right now. So menu planning takes time and skill, and we're not being given enough of the prioritization of that to have it done well at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems obvious, I think, when you describe it like that, Heather, because I mean, even in my own home, we've got three people, we've got three different sets of tastes, and right, and while I do most of the cooking and menu planning, right, I'm still engaging with everybody, sort of saying, well, what would you like to have for dinner this week or next week? And we get our own turns, right? But right, to create that satisfaction, and then teaching, my son, it's like, well, to get the things you want, you're going to have to eat some things that you may not be your favorites, but it is about negotiation,
It
planning, and
is.
compromise, right?
It is. Yeah.
When you've got a home, right, with 100 different people in it, with all, it gets that much more complicated. So yeah, I think it's a fair point, and then
Yeah.
it takes, requires an investment, I guess, to prioritize this. It's not
Yeah.
just about full bellies at the end of the day.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we found with the Making the Most of Mealtime study that, again, it was in 4 provinces. And there were certainly differences between provinces, and that would be the funding, and that maybe the staffing level in homes. But we found that even within a province, we had 8 different homes. There was variability in the quality of the menu, which meant it came down to the person in the home or whoever was creating that menu and how they were doing it. And some better practices, for example, would be to have residents doing taste testing, residents to having meaningful input to the menu.
Mm-hmm.
Homes in Ontario have to have a residents council, and they talk about food, but it has to be meaningful. They have
Yeah.
to feel like the choices they're making are actually borne out and are acted on, right? And that needs to happen more than it is now. And again, it's that time and flexibility to be able to do that is, I think, part of the challenge, and the money to be that flexible too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally. So speaking about money, and attention, I guess. I mean, you're certainly coming out of the pandemic in terms of another, not wasted sort of crisis. I mean, governments, provinces, and territories are poised to be making massive investments in long-term care and building new homes, new capital um, expenditures, refitting older homes. Right, so there's more attention on long-term care than there's been for a generation, if not ever. Um, so before people start building new homes and changing these homes, based on the work that you've been doing, I mean, what would be your advice in terms of that would inform, I guess, the design perhaps of homes, and as it revolves around meal times and food service?
Yeah. I think we see that in a physical space, when it's more intimate, it's a better dining experience. So rather than you think about yourself going into a big mall, how chaotic the food court is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now couple that with people who have limited mobility, perhaps hearing challenges, perhaps dementia. That environment's just way too big. So a more intimate space that's appropriate for the number of people that are in there. You don't want too small a space and too many people too. That's not the right idea. So smaller dining rooms would be the goal. There's been some work on household models, and they seem to be a better process, but I must say I haven't seen anything around food intake and that and understanding the mealtime experience from those spaces yet. That's something for me to do in the future, I guess, in terms of research. But natural light, you think about sitting in a dining room that doesn't have natural light or where you can't see the outside. That would be important. So a dining space, you should be able to see the outside. You should also have good lighting at the table level so that people can see their food
Mm-hmm.
all seasons of the year, as we live in Canada, which we know how it gets dark at some points in the year when we're
Mm-hmm.
eating. Um, Having furniture that's comfortable, accessible, but also flexible. I sometimes find homes buy furniture and they're sort of stuck then with this type of furniture. When a different type of residence comes in, now they have this furniture that doesn't work anymore. So having tables that might go up and down in terms of their adjustment, allow wheelchairs to get under. Is really important. I mean, it'd be lovely if we could transfer people to wheelchairs into dining chairs, but that just doesn't happen. There's enough staff to do that, quite frankly, to have
Mm-hmm.
people sitting in dining chairs. That'd be preferred, of course, but that doesn't always happen. And then finally thinking about rather than having a pass-through window where food comes out of the wall, to a server, having a counter that looks like a normal kitchen counter, where people can feel like they can come up and get a beverage or family members can go behind and wash their hands or whatever it may be. That's what we would hope for. This is probably going to make some food safety people crazy when I say that, but that's what we'd love to see is that open sort of servery. So it feels like a kitchen, right? It feels like food isn't just coming out of this cubby hole in the wall or out of a bulk steam cart that's been rolled into the middle of the dining room sort of thing, which seems rather artificial. So those would be the things I'd love to see happening in these physical dining spaces, thinking about, maybe 20 people at most in the dining area, an open style servery where people can go up and get a glass of juice if they want it. They can open the fridge themselves. Again, it makes the food safety people probably a bit crazy, but if it's their home, we should have that sort of opportunity, I think.
Yeah, well, and yes, I agree. I think and it makes sense even more so, I think, as earlier part of our conversation around the dementia side of things. And if that is going to continue to be, more and more, seniors and elderly people living with dementia and in, need of homes that can be attuned to their needs, um, it makes sense that creating spaces that are more familiar and more comfortable probably is going to be critical to their well-being. So as you've covered a little bit already in terms of the plus, and the need for sort of massive change in terms of our change management approach to culture and staff development. Um, Can you describe a little bit more in terms of like the things that are included in the programs and the manuals that you're teaching, in terms of what needs to happen to allow for that change management to be successful and adopted?
Yeah, great question. So again, it comes back to having the team feel empowered to make change. And here I'm using team broadly. So
Mm-hmm.
residents, team members, family members that might be involved in the space. And so our e-learning talks about training a champion to engage that broader team about what is it that they'd like to see changed in the dining room, first off, considering these principles, right? So educating people on what the principles are. And this is what we'd want to see in mealtimes. And the principles resonate with everybody, Dale, right? They resonate with you immediately as well as everybody else listening today. They make
Mm-hmm.
sense, right? So people, yeah, this is what we should be doing. And when you give people the time and space to say, how can we make connecting better? How are we honoring people's dignity at mealtimes the way that we should? And giving them the opportunity to talk about that and what they want to see happen. That takes a period of time, obviously understanding what is the most important things to start working on changing. And many of them are um, low-hanging fruit, not high cost. It's just a different way of doing things, right? Um, and so that's the first key thing we try to get people is realize this takes time and think about the change and what it is that needs to be changed. And then once they have that, learning some basic things about how change happens. So behavior change techniques. We like to use the behavior change wheel in this program and the COM-B framework, which is capability, opportunity, motivation, changes behavior. So I often think we think, oh, I tell someone to do something, it will happen. Right? And that's not how behavior change happens, as we all know. You have to think through, well, why don't they do it now this way? So what is how do we change the opportunity to make it easy to do the right thing? How do we motivate people? So often just teaching them the principles of going, we want to do better. That's the motivation, perhaps. But do they have the capability? Capability could be skills, could be time, could be knowledge to do these things that we want them to do. And when you realize, tease out, why isn't it happening? Is it capacity? Is it opportunity? Is it motivation? Then you realize what you target. Is it education to motivate people? Is it using story of a success of where when it was done, this actually really benefited a resident, a team member, or whomever, right? So that's a key piece of it. And then we also teach them using the basic cycle of QI change, right? Plan, do, check, and act, right? This cycle of you can plan to do it, put it into place, check to see if it worked, right? And then if it didn't work, figure out why it didn't work and tweak it again. And these
Hmm.
cycles of change and realize change takes time. So I think those key learnings for people really help them to realize, hey, if we're going to make a change, one, we have to really invest that time and effort into it. So we're going to want to make sure it's a change we really want to do too, right? Something like noise, for example. But many of the things they realize they can do quite readily. We also have these two checklists that are part of the program, and they're on the website for anybody to use. But one is the mealtime practices checklist, and it focuses in on the principles of choice. So connecting, and it actually asks team members to ask themselves questions about how they do their work role when they are in the dining room, maybe interacting with someone who requires eating assistance. Do they do these things? It sort of tweaks them to, yeah, I'm not doing that, or I need to do that better, right? And so that sort of, again, awareness of how to enact the choice principles is there with that practice checklist. And then the other checklist is around the dining environment. So some of the things we talked about today that make it a more physically appealing, easy, functional dining space that you can think about, like lighting, for example. And those might take more of an investment, but they help people to realize, hey, we really need to think about rearranging the way we do our tables here. The flow isn't really good, or it works for team members but doesn't work for residents. Or we've got the dish cart here, which is really noisy, and maybe we need to do something differently, right? So those checklists help people think through what their challenges are. The last component of the Choice Plus program is we actually have a community practice, which is just starting actually next month. And so people are welcome to come and chat with myself and Dr. Sarah Wu about what they're trying to change. And we'll
Hmm.
talk about these behavior change techniques as well, and walk through some case examples for folks. And so we're kicking that off. We're not sure how it will go. Hopefully it'll go well. But we recognize that people need that support after that e-learning as well.
Great, thank you. Well, maybe at the end of this, or you can provide us with some links to some of these different resources and things like that, Heather, and we can include them in their show notes for people who want to learn more about these. Um, I guess one of the other things I guess I reflect on, based on what you've described, and even the PDSA sort of cycle. I mean, well, our conversation today has centered around, meal times and food service delivery, which occupies a significant part of all of our lives. But all of us have that in our lives, right? So I think it's highly relatable, um, and gives us capacity for compassion and empathy, perhaps, about why these things are important. Um, but there's nothing to say that the choice plus sort of framework that you've provided here can't be applied to other parts of the care, in whether it's in a long-term care home or any other part of our healthcare system. It can be applied to recreation or bathing or any other aspects that are part of these
Yeah.
residents' lives.
And actually, if you the domains of well-being for persons living with dementia, I have a colleague, Dr. Al Power, who is also part of the Schlegel-UW RIA, and he's an expert in this area. But those 7 domains of well-being map very nicely onto choice.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that idea that you're right, that these concepts are things we should think about beyond meals as well, for sure. And thinking about when you said anywhere, I agreed. One of my hopes is that we can start to move this out to caregiver in the community training.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of caregivers, when a person they live with has dementia, it can be really challenging and
Mm-hmm.
frustrating, and recognizing that, hey, let's sit back and think about what's really meaningful about this meal. It isn't that it's absolutely wonderfully nutritious, and yes, you hear a dietitian saying that, it's about these other things, right? And maybe it's just about enjoying the food, and so what if someone picks up their food with their fingers? Who cares? It's really about the enjoyment. It's about the person feeling dignified, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, coming full circle as you described, your relationship with your child, and right, and we're talking about, people, at in the final stages of their lives, right? This is a huge cycle that unites us all, and it is something I think that we need to certainly honor, to use your language, throughout. So. Any final words to you, Heather? I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I hope others can take from this the wisdom that you've shared in terms of how they apply it. But yes, any other final words as we
Well,
close off?
I'm just so glad that we've had this conversation as well, because I think we often get tied up in what we're eating, right?
Mm-hmm.
But remembering how we eat. And again, the pandemic, I think people realized the importance of these shared activities in our lives, how incredibly important they are for us. Not only our psychosocial, but also our physical, right? Because we know people tend to eat better when they're eating with others. So I'm so glad we're putting some spotlight on that today. So thank you very much, Dale.
Thank you, Heather. So, bon appetit. Thank you again for sharing all of your stories, your research, your passion. And yeah, I look forward to having other conversations with you in the future.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Take care. You've been listening to the HQ, and I'm Dale Sherback, your host. You can find this and other future episodes on the CHA Learning website, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We'd love to hear what you think, so please follow us on our other social media channels. Thanks for joining us in this discussion today. Please join us next time.